Alexis, may I now invite you to briefly introduce yourself and to present the thrust of your paper, please?
Yes, thank you to Peter and all the people gathered in the very interesting Zero project that cost me many, many worries, because in the Buddhist field, well, we very often associate the interpretation of the Buddhist shunyata with the zero, and in a certain way it's the reverse we should do. That is to say, interpreting the zero number from the shunyata philosophy. I'm very glad to be here on this Zero project. I'm professor actually in Beijing, in Renmin Daxue. I come from France, and I made my PhD on Buddhist Sanskrit text, translated that, interpreting from Sanskrit to French. And so I was invited on the topic of the influence and the eventual influence of Buddhism on the invention and development of zero. So what the great interest or contribution of the new dating for the Bakhshali manuscript was only for me to authorize to leave aside the question of knowing in which cultural zone the zero found its origin. And we can assume now with much greater assurance that zero is Indian by birth. So it was a good point for me to enclose a bit the question. And this new dating invites us to focus on the Indian cultural space to deepen our understanding of the philosophical or metaphysical conditions for the appearance of this strange mathematical object. This new dating so allows us to modify the question that would be no more, where does zero come from? But why was this astonishing mathematical object born in India, and how can this birth and its condition be explained and determined? So the thesis, or if you want, the hypothesis, which is more correct, of my article was that Buddhism could very well be the philosophic field, or in a much more phenomenological way of speaking, the transcendental field from which the invention of the mathematical zero makes sense. Buddhism might constitute an a priori framework of meaning favorable and even constitutive of the Indian zero. That is to say, as it is used in the Bakhshali manuscripts, but also through its development in Brahmagupta's theory, for example. So Buddhism could be the philosophical field of birth and development of the mathematical and Indian zero, also named Shunya. And I prefer to mention it. It was not in that article a question of proving this, but just of establishing more precisely the possibility of this influence. And our paper was organized in 7 parts. So first, Greco-Buddhist contexts of apparition of the Bakhshali manuscripts. Second, the difficulties for determining precisely a clear influence at work in these manuscripts. Third, well, assuming the prevalence of Buddhism influence in the region where these manuscripts were discovered. Fourth, how the philosophical field of Buddhism is favorable for the appearance of the zero. 5, the Mahayanist shunyata and the interpretation of shunya as number, the link, the philosophical link between them. 6, a development around shunyata as both understood as space open and pratitya samutpada, that is to say, something like an interactional game or a reciprocal process or operational dimension, which fits very good with mathematics. And 7th, establishing a more precise link between the work of Brahmagupta and Buddhism, because it's in the Brahmagupta's works that the real zero take is real and deep form. So on that first moment, we should investigate a bit this Greco-Buddhist context of apparition of the Bakhshali manuscripts. We knew that it was in the Peshawar region, that is to say in the ancient Gandhara, that these manuscripts were founded. And this region was a real crossroads of commerce and civilization. So it was a really rich period, really rich region of cultural interactions and upheavals. And because of that, it caused many difficulties in researching a clear influence of this text and hence of the origin of the zero. Another point that we must add, that in that region, despite these crossroads, multiple influences, the Greek and the Buddhist influence were surely the strongest. So taking that into account, now we must see the difficulties for determining a precise and clear influence at work in the Bakhshali manuscripts. First point, we must assume that a contemplative tradition, such as Buddhism, seems very far away from the mathematical concern present in the Bakhshali manuscripts. Second, the introductive and conclusive pages of the manuscript are missing. And these pages were devoted traditionally to the presentation of the author, and in these pages happens very traditionally something like a religious dedication. So we don't have that. And that is to say, we don't have explicit influence in this mentioned inside these Bakhshali manuscripts. The remaining pages only deal with arithmetics, giving a large number of problems associated with daily life that don't fit well with the higher dimension of the practices and reflections of Buddhism. And the very arithmetical and practical purpose of the manuscripts doesn't seem to require the aid or the influence of Buddhism. On the reverse part of the influence, that is to say the Greek one, well, the eventually Greek influence is neither explicit nor implicit in the Bakhshali manuscripts. The form and the style of these manuscripts are entirely Indian. And we must add to that this new dating makes the hypothesis of a direct Greek influence far more fragile. So why insisting for finding a Buddhist influence? Because this influence cannot be ignored, given its pervasiveness across the whole of the northwestern region, and also because of the development of the Indian zero, of which the Bakhshali manuscripts are first known evidence, and that could not have arisen from nowhere. It demands a philosophical basis, which Buddhism, more than any other movement, is likely to have supplied. So let's assume the prevalence of Buddhist influence in the region where and when these manuscripts of Bakhshali were discovered. So, of course, no explicit reference to Buddhism within the Bakhshali manuscripts, but they were produced in a region very strongly influenced by Buddhism. And this influence is maybe not inside the manuscripts, but surely surrounded them. The history of this Gandhara region during the time of the Bakhshali manuscripts showed the progressive hegemony of Buddhism on political side or political plan, cultural plan, and also scientific plan. Some aspects of this Gandharian version of Buddhism was very creative very innovative and very speculative, was great provider of concepts, and especially in metaphysical order. This Buddhism, this Gandharian Buddhism, has a strong taste for logic and for the art of reasoning, which fits very well with mathematics. Other point, very important, in this Gandharian region was found many monasteries organized as universities or research centers, where not only Buddhism was taught, but also astronomy, grammar, and of course, mathematics. It was not only religious. These kind of separation are really Western in a certain way. So, how the philosophical field of Buddhism should be favorable for the appearance of the zero? Maybe we should change the question. Given the obviously strong influence of Buddhism in this region and at the time of the Bakhshali manuscripts, how could it not have an influence of them? The question is therefore much more what is in this Buddhism influence and how to determine it, that was there an influence of Buddhism on Bakhshali manuscripts? It's a great example. The researcher, very well known, Rudolf Hörnler, had already established two similarities between the manuscripts and the Buddhist texts: the language, the metrics on one hand, but also the style of reasoning on the other hand. So maybe we should find another influence around precisely this invention of the zero. So, as you already know, there is no zero, that is to say, O symbol found in the Bakhshali manuscripts for representing Shunya, but only a simple dot, that is to say, a bindu in Sanskrit. In the manuscripts, the zero dot does not have yet the statue of a number, as it will have, for example, in the Brahmasputta Siddhanta of Brahmagupta. But it is only a placemaker used to indicate an empty space or a hiatus. So the zero didn't mean just nothing in these manuscripts. That is to say, a pure deprivation of being, a pure non-being, but more subtly, it referred to a vacant space or place, which is not the same at all. And this relation between a kind of nothingness, a kind of note, if you want, and some kind of freedom or fundamental availability, that is to say, a vacancy. Well, and also the idea that the nothing could liberate something, that the nothing is a complementary face of the free, was here clearly established since the beginnings of Buddhism. For example, the notion of nirvana also relies on the same idea, since it signifies both extension and liberation at the same time. There is also the case of this major ancient Buddhist school named Sarvastivada, and this school of Sarvastivada was found in this Gandharian region, that is to say, where the manuscript of Bakhshali were found. This school of Buddhism, Sarvastivada, determine what the shunyata, that is to say, the vacancy. I prefer translating shunyata by vacancy and not by emptiness for metaphysical reason. So this shunyata does not in any way prevent the existence of reality, but in some way established it. It's a very fertile conception of nothingness, not a conception of nothingness which should be opposed radically to being. It is because shunyata was considered from the idea of an empty place, that is to say, from the idea of availability, and not from a pure note or non-existence, that there is no contradiction in affirming both vacancy and existence, and that the first may precede the later. And the use of zero as placeholder, as well as the fact that it can symbolize the unknown in an equation, as it is used perfectly in the Bakhshali manuscripts, agrees entirely with the metaphysics of the Sarvastivada, and even to the point of being its most simple mathematical application. Other point interesting of correspondence, the use of a dot, that is to say the bindu, as a symbol for zero. And it was also used by the Sarvastivadian thinkers for symbolizing the most elementary entity of reality, named Kshana, which could be understood as atom of time, and which was understood as a position of termination and initializing both, as it is used as the use of the zero as placeholder in the decimal scheme in use in the Bakhshali manuscripts. So it's conveyed totally. Another very interesting correspondence between Bakhshali manuscripts and Buddhist texts, according to the Sarvastivadian school, the passage from nothing to something, that is to say in mathematics from 0 to 1, was named Rupa, by the Sarvastivadian, and the figure 1 was also named Rupa in the Bakhshali manuscripts. Very interesting correspondence. So, another important moment for establishing this influence is to see how the conception of shunyata should serve as a basis for the interpretation of shunya as a number. I would like to promote the idea that the influence of Buddhism on zero was not only possible at the beginning, that is to say, only during the Bakhshali manuscript time, but also accompanied the development of it in the work of Brahmagupta, for example. What an example. Brahmagupta's works so developed many points from the elements present in the Bakhshali manuscripts, among which the zero rightly stands out, moving from a strictly positional statue to one which was much more operative and philosophically deeper, that is to say, of a number. In parallel, it was the notion of shunyata which would experience significant conceptual development with the advent of the Mahayana, whose kinship with the Sarvastivada school is fully acknowledged. So we see a correspondence between Buddhism and mathematics developments, which both take place around the same notion of shunya. It's interesting to see how Buddhism, and particularly Mahayana, could become the philosophical field for the invention of the number zero, as it is found in exemplary form in Brahmagupta. And reversely, the Greek philosophical field was totally unsuitable for the development of the mathematical zero. The introduction of the Arabic zero during the end of the Middle Age in the West, this Middle Age was very Aristotelian, was so difficult and occurred so many prohibitions because the philosophical field was not good enough for the apparition of the mathematical zero. We can only be amazed, given the problem encountered in the West, at the ease with which Brahmagupta introduced the number zero into his work, and with almost no introduction, in the way of evidence, showed how this number behaved in various operations. Nowhere in the Brahmasputa Siddhanta is there the least reluctance, hesitation, or awkwardness in the chapter about shunya, or even any in-depth explanation about the fact that he gave it's the statue of a number. Let's us once more note that it cannot be taken for granted that nothing can be operative. However, since Brahmagupta does indeed do this, there must be some prior conditions making it acceptable, conditions which indeed are found together in Mahayanic Buddhism. So let's see this Buddhist interpretation of shunyata, and more specifically the Mahayanic interpretation of shunyata, which is more structured in a certain way, more in deep. And let's see how this interpretation fits with this promotion of shunya as a number, an operative being in mathematics. So the word first, it's very important to notice that the word shunya already existed before its mathematical use. So it is not then the figure, the symbol, which gives the meaning to the word, but the word which indicates the significance of the symbol, of the mathematical symbol, or the mathematical figure. Brahmagupta so defined the zero, firstly, not from its value and mathematical role, but from what the common notion of shunya evokes to him. So he speaks of space, of openness, and even of the vault of heaven. And these images were also in a number of Mahayanic texts, Buddhist texts, used to describe either the nature and the experience of shunyata. The idea of openness, of free space, appear also in the etymology of the word shunya itself, whose Indo-European roots relates, for example, to the Greek quar, which means openness, referring especially to the ears or needles. And it's very interesting because nowhere in the Greek mathematics you have something like the word quar. So the symbol zero, like that is the shape of a hole or of an opening, represents this idea inside the words very well. And it's another argument in favor of the Indian origin of the symbol. The Mahayanists, and especially Nagarjuna, also produced a very original interpretation of shunyata meaning. Not, absolutely not, from nothingness, that is to say deprivation of being, but from the idea of interaction and reciprocal operativity. And it fits perfectly with the use of shunya as a number. So let's see more closely this relation between Brahmagupta and Buddhism. Although even Brahmagupta was certainly not a Buddhist, we know that. He lived in a place and at a time when there was indisputably a strong Buddhist presence, and at a time when Buddhist thinking was becoming more and more logical and epistemological. Brahmagupta has no need to be Buddhist to feel its influence, just as Euclid didn't need to be a member of the Platonic Academy to be influenced by Platonic metaphysics. Buddhism has then become a part of the ambience, of the mood of Indian thoughts. And this factor, without doubt, opened up a possibility of an operative use of zero. And to express it in a Kantian form, we should say, Buddhist thinking about shunyata provides the condition of possibility for the mathematical shunyata. In other words, to make it thinkable. And more phenomenologically, because I come from phenomenology, I should say that Buddhist conception of shunyata constitutes a very favorable transcendental field, both for the origin and also the development of the mathematical shunyata. That is to say, from the Bakhshali manuscripts, from the Brahma Sputa Siddhanta of Brahmagupta. Thank you.